Welcome to the Dork Forest. Jackie and her pals will never bore us. Shameless confessions
about our obsession
will make us laugh and smile. So let's explore the Dork Forest and dork out for a while.
Happy New Year! Hey, it's January. Welcome to the Dork Forest. You know the websites, JackieCation.com, DorkForest.com, TheDorkForest.com. This month, we don't have a sponsor this month, so feel free to donate to the Dork Forest. Everyone should give me $100 a year, I feel. You could give me them in $8 increments. I have not set up any way for you to do that easily. Anyway, go to JackieCation.com or DorkForest.com and fill in the donation button, and then I will be donated to. The credits, of course. Patrick Brady, gonna fix this audio, thank God. And he is a wonderful man. Then Mike Rickberg sang that song, composed it and sang right there at the beginning with his girlfriend Sarah. He's gonna sing the Mexican hat dance at the end of the show. And Vilmos fixes the website, hosts the website, has his own podcast called Green Room Radio. Feel free to listen to that. Thank you so much for tuning in. There's a lot of merch you can get at JackieCation.com, Dork Forest stuff, and there's also my stand-up schedule. This week I am in New York until the 19th doing stand-up shows and live Dork Forests. At the end of the month, I'm in San Francisco doing Sketchfest, a live Dork Forest, and a bunch of sets. So if you are in San Francisco or New York, that's going to happen. Otherwise, I'm wandering around the world doing stand-up comedy. Check my dates at JackieCation.com. Feel free to follow at JackieCation on Twitter. And there is a Ranger of the Dork Forest group that you can ask to join on Facebook where there's a couple hundred Rangers there just talking about shows and talking about their own dorkdoms. So if you want to join that group, it's on Facebook. Okay, too much. This is a great one. Tune in. Thanks a lot for listening, folks. Hey, it's Jackie Cation. I'm here with Brian Thompson. I was on your podcast, Quit It, on AmateurScientist.org. That was like a year and a half ago.
It was a long time ago. I barely remember it.
Me too.
That I had a great time. You were very charming.
I remember it being charming and lovely. Brian Thompson, people, he does, you're writing for the UCB sketch?
Yeah. I'm now writing for UCB mod team, which is their house sketch teams.
That's awesome. And your first show is going to be in February, right?
February 18th.
February 18th,
we don't know
here in
our
Los Angeles.
name yet. Yes, in Los Angeles only.
Right.
We're not bi-coastal yet. Right. But we're going to be paired up with New Money, which is sort of a legacy team that's been there for a while. We're a brand new team. And
I know the word legacy from the movie dang it, I'm brain freeze with the
Home Alone.
Nope.
You put your hands on your face and say
right, and did a squishing motion
go straight to
because it's a good way to go. What I say is the movie is set in the college, 1977. John Belushi.
Animal House.
That's it. Animal House. That's the only reason I know the word legacy, because they had legacy people. Such a long way to go.
This is a legacy. If your parents were on a sketch team at UCB, you can just totally get right in.
Oh, I want that to be it. I want that to be what it is.
Yeah, no, not quite.
What is a legacy team?
They were there last year. I'm not sure how many years they've been there. There are teams that sort of roll over and then teams retire and new teams are born. Right. And we're a brand new team. I'm very excited about it.
That is exciting. And I love UCB, so it's always a sweet treat. Okay, so it is, I'm doing stand up in New York this week. Find me at JackieCation.com and stalk me via Foursquare or whatever the hell, or Uber. Maybe you drive an Uber.
Any of those. So Brian Thompson, you said to me, can I please talk about Vonnegut? Because it's been a year and a half, and we talked a year and a half ago about you being on the Dork Forest talking about Vonnegut. Because you enjoy the works of Kurt Vonnegut. I love Kurt Vonnegut.
All of it?
Pretty much. I mean, there are definitely ups and downs. Vonnegut, one of the things I find inspirational about Vonnegut is that at any point in my life where I feel like maybe I should have gotten started in my career
when you were 4,
a lot sooner,
when Mozart did.
You see these people who have like TV shows and they're 20 years old,
right? And
it's like Vonnegut didn't have his big success until he was in his late 30s, his 40s,
right?
And part of that was that he spent a long time as sort of a work-for-hire, golden age of science fiction sort of short story writer.
Oh, he did the Pulp Fiction-y kind of stuff?
Yeah, like the Ray Bradbury, Isaac Asimov type stuff.
And that stuff, some of those are pretty good. A lot of them are kind of very forgettable.
Right. I'm sure it was soul sucking.
It was before he kind of found his voice.
Sure. But you got to perform to find your voice. You got to write to get your voice, I guess. So did you read Vonnegut when you were a kid?
I didn't. Well, I guess technically I was a kid. I was maybe like a junior or a senior in high school. And,
Was it Slaughterhouse-5?
It wasn't.
Thank God.
I had always heard about Slaughterhouse-5. You always hear the name Slaughterhouse-5, and I think I had been exposed to the movie.
Okay.
I think maybe I had rented the movie from the library on the VHS.
Nice.
And then found it really boring and didn't watch past the first 5 or 10 minutes.
Right. They didn't really, it's such a convoluted story that it's very hard to make it into. I always confused it in high school with Catch-22. Yeah. Which is a great movie.
Yeah. And a very similar kind of book, Catch-22. Joseph Heller, I think, was Vonnegut's favorite writer. They were definitely friends.
Oh, that's neat.
I think Vonnegut's favorite Joseph Heller book was a book called Something Happened.
Oh, yeah.
Which I don't know if you've ever read that.
I have not.
It's very strange. It's a book just about a guy who's sort of a sad sack schmo who just comes home and his life is miserable, and it's about 400 pages of this.
Oh, fantastic. That sounds like R. Crumb without the pictures. And guess what? I don't want any part of that. I'm sorry, Joseph Heller.
Oh, well, I mean, it's not as good as R. Crumb. There's no, like, big booty ladies that he's climbing all over.
Right, which is another part of the thing that never drew me to R. Crumb.
Yeah.
But people do like R. Crumb.
Sure.
And one of my listeners was like, you gotta read Linda Barry. And Linda with a Y, Barry. And she is now older, but she's always done, I think, I'm spacing everything. My brain is on 3 tracks right now. But Linda Barry, I'll put it in the notes, we'll find it. And she did cartoons, and then she also does comics, rather, and then she also does prose. But it's very slice of life. It can be sort of that sad sack slice of life stuff.
The one, she's kind of got frizzy hair and round glasses, and she's in a lot of like comics documentaries.
I don't know.
Oh boy, I wonder if that's the same
she
person.
She seems. I've the guy suggested it, so I went and I read some interviews with her, and she sounds hilarious and funny, but I have a hard time getting into. I've been given a lot of books recently, and I'm doing it. I'm plugging along, and he's like, I want to send you this one book. It's called 100 Demons, and I looked at it, and it looked really dark, and I couldn't face it, and so I said, don't waste your money. I'll try to get to it, but I don't want you to waste your money because I may not read it. And he was like, well, I just think she's really, really very inspirational for women. And I was like, I can't. I'm panting. With the idea of reading that book right now. So,
as a big like literature nerd and like liberal arts snob, I'm perfectly fine with like a difficult book.
Yeah.
But I have in my life sort of given up on difficult books that are also extremely dark and depressing.
Right. I'm not going to read Victoria's Secret.
It's a great book.
Virginia Woolf is
George Eliot's Victoria's Secret.
Right. She walks into the river and, but she's only wearing underpants, and that's where it gets exciting.
Oh, so good. Virginia Woolf though?
Yeah, Virginia Woolf.
You're gonna read Virginia
I've
Woolf?
never been able to finish any Virginia Woolf. There's things that I haven't been able to read that I would like to read. I had Carrie Brownstein on the show, and she was talking about how much she loved Evelyn Waugh.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
And other post World War I sad sack authors. And I was like, I wish I could, cause I know that they're beautifully written. I know that the prose, it's like I would love to read poetry.
Yeah.
Cause poetry is it's a lot of smart words are being done. I could learn things.
People know you're smart when you can quote it.
Sure. I'd love to. I have books up in my house, that are just on display. It's, best of luck.
Yeah. I've got that giant, the complete works of Allen Ginsberg.
Yeah.
Which at a time in my life I read and enjoyed the same that I would enjoy a novel.
Yeah.
But that time is totally past.
Yeah, tick-tock already. Like I've got a lot of classical mythology here that I enjoyed at the time, but I can't. There's not a lot of rereading of Oedipus going on or Aeschylus or whatever I'm trying to say. Wow, it's going to be a great episode.
It is.
Brian Thompson, let's talk about Kurt Vonnegut.
Well,
the first one I read was Mother Night.
Really?
Yeah.
That's really interesting. That's the one that I used to teach.
Oh, really?
When I was a high school English teacher.
Oh, wow.
And the reason I chose that one was because I thought it was particularly relevant to our modern society.
Yeah.
And the whole theme of Mother Night, if people haven't read it, it's about a guy who works for the Nazis as a propagandist, but he's a double agent for the United States.
Right.
But he does this for so long that he basically just lives his life as a Nazi propagandist.
Right. And then finally the Israelis are like, well, we're going to kill you.
Right. Yeah.
And he's like, but I worked for the CIA. And the CIA's like, we've never been able to admit that.
Exactly. But the theme of it is that you are what you pretend to be.
Right.
To a very large extent.
And while it has flashback stuff in it, it's pretty linear. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty easy to read as far as a linear, that was one of my problems with Slaughterhouse-5 is that I never knew where the hell I was.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that was purposeful with Slaughterhouse-5 because he was sort of trying to emulate that sort of state of just massive confusion of World War II, especially his role in World War II.
Right. Which was the first one you read?
Timequake, which is it was actually his last novel.
Really? Because I don't think I read that one.
That was like late 90s. And it was because it was a gift from my girlfriend at the time. She thought I would really like it.
Right.
And she was very right.
Oh, good.
Timequake has, as the years went on, Vonnegut sort of stopped caring much about plots. And basically all of his books are autobiographies to a certain extent.
Right. That's interesting. I think the last one I read of his was Hocus Pocus.
Yeah. That was like 90, 91, something like that. It
would have been 89. I have 89? The list in front of me, 1989.
Yeah.
And this is chronological. So Timequake was not his last book.
Not his last book. So, after Timequake was his last quote-unquote novel. Because it was like a plot. And then everything after that are like nonfiction compilations or Bagombo's Snuff Box is a compilation of his previously unpublished, like old short fiction.
Really old short fiction?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like his old sci-fi stories.
Interesting. Okay. So Timequake last novel.
Yeah. And it's barely a novel. It's the plot is that there's this thing called a timequake, which is that everybody just basically stops and is zoomed back a year, and so it's like you've had an out-of-body experience where you're in your body from a year ago, and you have to, like a robot, go through the entire year again. And just sort of passively watch all of the things that happen in this year. You can't change anything. You can't control yourself. It's just everybody in the world re-experiences
the last
year. But really, it's just an autobiography because he just veers off of that plot whenever he wants to and talks about his own life and himself. He's a very big part of that book.
Okay. But what an interesting, I do love his theory of like what life would be like if you could do some of these things. That's one of the greatest things about fiction writers.
Right.
That I don't have, you know how people always say, I have a book in me. Mm-hmm. I don't know that I have a book in me. Because or at least I don't have this many. This is amazing, this kind of thing.
Yeah, he was very, very prolific. Mm-hmm. He was just, he was a writer's writer. I was like one of that generation of people who.
Right. They're all in the background going, woohoo, I love it when he writes.
Yeah. I don't know. I love to write, but I love rewriting. Like, I hate, and I think a lot of writers are like this, where it's like
you hate the first draft?
Yeah. The process of putting it down is just torturous.
Okay.
But there are some people, like, Stephen King puts out a book every 2 weeks.
Right,
He just loves sitting at that typewriter and tapping away. For
my birthday, I have a book that I am sitting on that is just too big. Mm-hmm. I can't do it. It's the one, and Dana Gould told me to read it.
Which
and
one?
I want to do everything Dana Gould tells me to do, quite honestly, because he's hilarious. And it's the Kennedy book.
I read that one.
Yeah. Does it start quick and go?
It moves, but it's so weird. I recommend it.
Okay.
It's so weird. Because basically the premise is that a guy finds this time portal and he uses it to try and stop the Kennedy assassination.
Right.
But 5/6 of this 1,000-page book or however long it is.
So long.
It's not that. It's just him hanging out in
1963.
He becomes a teacher.
And he's just psyched about the haircuts and dresses.
It's weird.
It's like Timequake. It's reliving a moment of your childhood, I guess. Yeah, to some extent.
Yeah. And there are those writers that are just they just like to tell a good yarn.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Stephen King is definitely one of those. I don't think Vonnegut was one of those, but he had that that kernel in him where he just loved a good sci-fi idea.
Right.
And so in his books, there's this recurring character of Kilgore Trout, who's like this.
Right. How many books was he in?
Kilgore Trout is in a bunch of them, and I forget how many he's in.
Were we introduced in Titan to Kilgore Trout? I feel like we might have been.
I don't know if you. I know he's in God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater. I don't know if he's mentioned in Slaughterhouse-5. He's a big part of Breakfast of Champions.
Man, I think Breakfast of Champions was the second one I read.
That was the second one I read.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. What was the first one you read? Did we? Oh, it was Timequake.
Yeah.
That's right. And yeah, and so Breakfast of Champions, I just remember him having the doodles in the middle of it.
Yeah.
Like the cat's butt. Mm-hmm. And because I was 19 and I was like, oh, that's hilarious. He drew a cat's butt.
Well, it's really cool because if you hadn't been exposed to something like that before, it's really, I mean, that you could just, like, he mentions an asshole and then there's just this little doodle of asterisk.
Of an asshole.
But
Yes.
yeah. I mean, you don't
get that.
You don't know that you can do that in a book.
Right. It was that was one of the greatest things about Vonnegut is that it felt like he was like making up the rules to what a novel could be as he wrote them.
Did you ever read The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy?
No.
By Lawrence Stern. This is I believe it's an 18th century novel. This is maybe like one of the first 5 novels ever written. And it's so strange because it's one of the first novels ever written, but it's also the first postmodernist novel ever written where there's weird tricks like that. It's hilarious. It's supposed to be this memoir of this guy is writing about himself, but it never actually gets beyond his birth because he just goes off on all these tangents. It's like everybody that shows up to his parents' house to witness his birth, he'll just like go and write about their whole backstory.
Right, he'll just continue to create the characters instead of ever talking about the main character,
and there's
what it's implied to be.
And it's in 18th century, but there are these weird things where like a character dies, and then it's like, and here's what it looked like to him when he died, and then the next page is just black. It's just all black ink.
What's the name of the author?
Lawrence Stern, Sterne. The book was made into a movie called A Cock and Bull Story.
Okay.
That Michael Winterbottom made that Steve Coogan stars in.
Wow.
But they adapted, like the book is unadaptable, like literally. So the movie is about people trying to make a movie and failing of this book.
Oh, I suppose. As opposed to many movies that just do that. Just all on their own. They're just it's a lot of art. Yeah. Did you see the movie for Mother Night?
Yeah.
Did you see the Nick Nolte movie? I thought that was a great adaptation,
it's
actually.
Good. It's good.
Yeah.
It's really hard to adapt Vonnegut and get that voice across because so much of Vonnegut's writing is voice. It's not plot. It's barely character, although I think he has great characters. It's just, movies have to have a structure that his books just don't have. Right.
There's no arc to it. It doesn't, but you know how they've taken so many Philip K. Dick books and turned them into movies with just, all they've done is just pulled the guts out of it and gone, we're going to rebuild around this and call it Minority Report. And, you know, and it's Blade Runner and Paycheck. And I mean, Paycheck had the greatest idea behind it, but
I never saw the movie.
It was,
it's Ben Affleck in
Ben
there?
Affleck, again, brain freeze. Ben Affleck couldn't ruin that movie because the idea was so awesome.
Yeah.
And it was just about getting a paycheck to do something horrible, and then they wipe your brain. Like you're essentially like a walking hard drive for somebody for like a minute, and then they wipe your brain, and then all of a sudden you have $1 million in your account, and you're like, oh, I wonder how I spent the last 4 months. And then you run into people who know you, and I'm sure Philip K. Dick did it in a way that was so convoluted, because that guy, I don't know if you've ever tried to read any Philip K. Dick.
Yeah. He was a crazy person.
Yeah.
It's quite literally a crazy person.
He was completely out of it.
He had that. There's a word for this syndrome, but when you believe that everyone else in the world is fake and you're the only one that's real, like everything else is a hologram or an illusion.
Right. What is that word? Someone's yelling it. There's a ranger of the Dark Forest yelling it on the...
I think he literally had that.
Yeah.
And there's a few of his later books sort of get that idea across. Actually, Total Recall has a lot of that in it.
And that's him as well. Yep.
Yeah, Total Recall is kind of a lot about how you don't know what your own identity is, and everything else in the world is basically just manufactured.
The only one that I made myself finish was that the High Castle one, because supposedly he was one of the first fiction writers, Philip K. Dick, to write about what if the Nazis won.
Yeah.
And I was like, what is that like? And it was like all of the rest of his books. It's a dystopian future where people continue to live their lives.
Yeah.
And
when I was a kid, I really enjoyed that kind of science fiction writing, that real idea-based, like Isaac Asimov, like what if...
Sciencey science kind
Yeah.
of. Yeah.
The Martian Chronicles
Yeah.
and all that stuff. And I still have appreciation for it, but I sort of kind of grew cold on it because so much of it is placing the idea above the characters.
Yeah.
And above the voice.
Yeah, sometimes, that...
Like a lot of it
Maybe
is
that's
just...
what... It doesn't feel as human. It doesn't feel warm.
It's like generic middle-aged man is
Right.
always the protagonist.
Right. Here's hero protagonist, and he will go forth in our lives. And
it could be exploring some interesting philosophical ideas. I think that's what attracted Vonnegut to writing science fiction. I think that's what attracts every science fiction writer to writing
because
science
his
fiction.
characters are very six-dimensional. I mean, they're from every angle.
A lot of them are basically just him. I think that's what clicked for him, and that's when he became successful. Is Slaughterhouse 5 really cemented it, but you can see it. You can really see it as early as The Sirens of Titan. Player Piano is his first novel.
Right.
And that's still very science fiction-y.
I can't remember that one. I read it, but...
It's a dystopian book it was inspired by his time working for GE, and it's this dystopian future where the upper classes basically operate and create all of these machines to do all the work for them. Mm-hmm. So all of the working class people are out of jobs because robots are taking over.
Okay.
Basically.
Yeah.
It's this theme that's been done over and over and over again. And
Right. But he did it, and if I remember correctly, I didn't mind it. I liked it.
It's good. It's
Yeah.
good, but he hadn't really found his voice yet. The Sirens of Titan is very sci-fi-y, very plot-based, but so crazy.
Yeah.
And you start to sort of see
more
Vonnegut as a person.
Yeah, you see more personalities of the people in it. Mm-hmm. Is Sirens of Titan where the lucky thing comes into effect? Is that where
there's it's
you can't
very
say that you were
convoluted.
lucky, and then they try to stone you to death.
There's a Martian invasion. There's a guy who's created his own spaceship. There's he has to go to Titan because it's the only place where he has a physical form.
Right.
There's some like probability matrix thing that's kind of similar to what Douglas Adams did much later.
Right. Are there leeches that live off of your pulse?
Yeah, it's been a long time since I read that.
Yeah. I remember that one.
It's great. I think that one holds up really, really well.
It really does.
Recall.
If you were going to read one Vonnegut book to start with, that's not a bad one.
It's not a bad one.
I'd go that or Mother Night, I guess.
Yeah, I mean there are a lot of good jumping on points. I think Mother Night is a good jumping on point.
Cat's Cradle.
Cat's Cradle, definitely. I think Cat's Cradle is like, from people I've talked to, that seems to be one that a lot of people read first.
Yeah, that one. It's not because I'm loath to use the word easiest, but it's kind of it's a quick read.
Yeah,
it's very linear and it's fun.
Yeah,
if I remember correctly.
But I think when Slaughterhouse 5, I think the reason that all congealed is because so like the main event in Vonnegut's life was that he was captured in World War II. He was in the army. He was in the Battle of the Bulge, and he was captured by the Germans. And they were shipped off to Dresden.
Right.
And they were forced to just basically be labor slaves for the Germans in Dresden. And they were housed in these old underground slaughterhouses.
Right.
And
he worked in a factory, right? It was a munitions factory, wasn't it?
I think he did a lot of different things.
Okay, but it was warehousey and factory work to some extent.
And then the Allies decided that they were going to just show off, because I think at this point the war was basically won. And so they were just like, they dropped the A-bomb in Japan, and in Europe.
Was the Dresden bombing after the A-bomb?
No, it was before, but it was like at that sort of point, like the war in Europe had pretty much been won, but then they just decided that they were going to carpet bomb a lot of these major cities just to
make their point and go, seriously, end this.
And then the war in the Pacific was basically won, and they decided we're going to just put a pin in this.
Right. But you could, I mean, the argument at the time was that they were like, we're trying to speed up the end of the war. We
Right.
don't want to negotiate with these people anymore. We're going to show them how badly we can really decimate them.
Yeah.
And so that's why they dropped the A-bomb. That's why they Dresden bombed.
And Dresden was like the Paris of Germany. Like it was the cultural center of Germany. It was a beautiful city, beautiful architecture, just decimated.
Right. They just rubble and fire, right?
And fire, it was a nightmare.
It wasn't napalm, but it was like that.
Something
right?
similar, like a predecessor to napalm. And so these POWs, these Allied POWs, were safe in these slaughterhouses underground, and they were like some of the few survivors.
Right.
And so after the bombing, the Germans made them do like body cleanup duty.
Right.
And Vonnegut and his fellow prisoners they spent days and days and days just piling bodies into piles and then shooting them with flamethrowers. It was a horrible thing.
Right. And then it just, that my social studies teacher in 9th grade, he drove a tank in World War II and he liberated, Dachau.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And he said that it was one of the grossest. I mean, he was like, you can't. And that his commanding officer made the people from the towns come and bury the dead. And he made the Germans come and dig all the mass graves for the Jews and everybody that was in Dachau.
Yeah.
And he made us watch these documentaries about World War II, which had footage of it was essentially the Why We Fight series, the Frank Capra. Mm-hmm. And he made us watch those. He was like, hey, I had to live through it. This is history and you're going to learn about it. And there you go. Get a note from your mom if you don't want to watch bodies piled.
Sure. I mean, and it definitely shaped the entire 20th century after that.
And it was Vonnegut's major. That was his thing.
That was his major life event. And Slaughterhouse 5 is he just decided, I'm going to stop sort of hinting around this. I'm just going to write about it.
Yeah.
And it's told through the eyes of a fictional character, but it's about a character, Billy Pilgrim, who survives the Dresden bombing.
Right.
And it becomes unstuck in time, according to the book. He'll find himself in his body in different points of his life. And at one point, he gets abducted by aliens, and he's put into this menagerie. But it's just sort of reflects this crazy mental state that war put these people in, who were children.
They were 19, 20 years old.
18, 19. A lot of them lied,
Right.
were 16, 17, saying that they were of age.
They're the only people who really want to go to war. Is when you're about 17, you're like, you know what I want to do? I want to free the world and be of some use, but you don't know how to do it. And you're like, well, I wonder if, I remember, whatever. But,
yeah. So I think after Slaughterhouse 5, he just, I think that's when he really came into his own. And then, for the rest of his life, he called on that. I mean, there are so many characters in his books a lot of his books are fictional books, but they're written in the form of memoirs, like first person memoirs for these fictional characters. And I think that over time, my favorite has become Bluebeard, because Bluebeard kind of sums up everything
of his life,
Vonnegut.
kind of.
I think so.
What was Bluebeard? I read it. I can't remember it.
Bluebeard is weird because it came in the middle of like this sort of lesser phase for Vonnegut. He churned out these books in the 80s that
87
are not really highly regarded, and for some of them for good reason. I think Galapagos is his worst book by a good margin.
Crying out loud! I just finished it like 2 years ago because I had it on a subway in 1989, and I left it on the subway, and I was like, I never did finish that book, and I was like, oh, it all doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Thank you, Vonnegut, as you age and get closer to death.
Yeah, I think he was having money problems, and so he was just trying to crank out as many books as possible. But and I don't think he has a very high opinion of Bluebeard, but
no, it isn't even on his list of Wikipedia giving himself grades.
No, right.
You're right. He gave Slapstick a D.
Yeah,
supposedly.
and I like Slapstick is hilarious, but I understand why he gave it a D.
And Breakfast of Champions he gives a C, and Happy Birthday Wanda June he gives a D. Palm Sunday, he gives a C, and it was his autobiography. It was the first autobiography he wrote.
I
this
think
Wikipedia thing is hilarious.
He was very distasteful of when he saw himself becoming over self-indulgent.
Right. Well, I mean, at least he could see it.
But if you love Vonnegut, that's great.
Right. You want Vonnegut to go down the rabbit hole of Vonnegut.
Authors are oftentimes the worst judges of their own work.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I remember I was listening to your Tolkien episode.
Right.
And you were talking about how Tolkien, like, in his dying wish was that he could go back and just completely rewrite The Hobbit and
Yeah.
make it more adult and more in line with The Lord of the Rings. But yeah, he's totally wrong about
He's
that.
completely wrong. He's just leave it alone. Leave it alone.
Yeah.
It's done.
But Bluebeard is a book about, it's about a guy who was a World War II veteran, came back from the war, and he was a very talented artist. Before the war, he was a very talented, like, realist artist. He was a draftsman. He could look at anything and he could draw a picture that was indistinguishable from a photograph.
Wow.
And he's actually an Armenian, first generation Armenian.
You know, he always had, that was the other reason that drew me to it, is that he was an Armenian guy. And in Wisconsin, when any Armenians came up, we were all very excited.
Yeah.
Yes.
The Armenian genocide is a huge part of that book.
Right, right.
The main character's parents were survivors and were
Right.
sort of tricked into coming into California thinking they were going to make their fortune and didn't work out.
All of America is a lie. The cake is a lie. Let's just do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, whatever's scratched on a wall is basically the truth. That's the only truth you can live by. So this main character, he loves art and he's really good at it, but it just never really clicks with him. He goes off to World War II, experiences some horrors,
Right.
comes back and just kind of has given up on art until he falls in with these abstract expressionists. And there are characters in the book that are real people, like Jackson Pollock and stuff. He falls in with
wow.
this crew and he's best friends with them. He was kind of wealthy at the time because he had collected a bunch of art when he was in war.
Okay.
And so he makes friends with all these people. He becomes an abstract expressionist artist himself. Mm-hmm. And his deal is that he paints giant canvases, one solid color, and then puts strips of tape on them. And it's a big deal. He gets
Right.
super rich and famous because of this. And then a few years later, it turns out that the brand of paint that he used was bad, and all of the paint from all of his canvases just sloughs off, and all of his paintings are destroyed, and he's just like basically a laughing stock. And he retires to this house in on Long Island, like in the Hamptons,
Right.
and doesn't want to do art ever again.
But doesn't it make it even greater art when it was just there for the moment that you had it?
Well, the whole point of the story, the book is often seen as sort of like Vonnegut's railing against abstract expressionism for being meaningless.
Yeah.
It's just a bunch of splotches and stuff.
Right.
That's not what it is. It's basically Vonnegut's, it's sort of a treatise on finding your voice
Yeah.
and inserting your own humanity into your art. This main character was a great artist growing up. I mean, he could look at anything.
The
like
realism.
I said, he was a great realist artist. He could do this, but there wasn't any soul in his art.
Okay.
It wasn't about his own experience, and it didn't click in any way.
Right.
And Vonnegut's argument isn't that abstract expressionism was bullshit. It's that the ones that were great, like Jackson Pollock and stuff,
Yeah.
they were able to put their soul into this artwork that might look meaningless to other people.
Oh, okay.
But that's what made them special, as opposed to your kid who just slaps some paint
Right. Right.
on canvas.
Yeah.
And so that's the whole point. It's called Bluebeard because it's named after this French folktale of this wealthy aristocrat who had a blue beard, who was very cruel.
Okay.
And he tricks some young girl into becoming his wife.
Right.
And he goes on vacation and he gives her a ring of a bunch of keys to all the rooms in his mansion. And he says, you can go in any room you want except one. And, of course, she goes into that room,
Gotta go into that room.
finds all of the corpses of his previous wives.
Oh my God. And that is your gift of finding that room. You get to join that pile of corpses.
There's always corpse in there. If
There's-
somebody tells you don't go in there.
No. It's do we learn nothing from the first time? It's one of those irritating things is when God goes, you can have anything in this room except for that apple.
Sure.
And you're like, now why would you bring up the apple? Why would you just you and the speculation in really again another author gone.
Tolkien and C.S. Lewis.
Oh,
Okay,
yeah.
C.S. Lewis is Out of the Silent Planet, and the space trilogy that he does. The lesson, because in the second book, which is called Perelandra, it takes place on Venus, and Venus is a new Eden, and the entire rule of Venus is that you can't stay overnight in one of the stationary lands. There is, everything else is a floating land. Everything is a floating island. And that's where all the good stuff is anyway. But there's, the devil comes and says, why the weird rule? Why the weird rule? Just stay here. Let's do this.
Yeah.
Let's show him. And they're trying to talk the new Eve into doing it. And so the whole book is a treatise of why would God do that? Why would anybody do that? You can be anywhere. And all it is, I guess, a lesson in obedience and trust. And so you're supposed to trust in the Lord and be obedient to the Lord.
I'm making the jack off motion in my head.
Exactly. And but you're like, crying out loud. Why the testing?
Yeah.
Why the constant?
Yeah. Again, that just raises more questions.
Right. Which is, Vonnegut, not a religious guy.
No, he was a secular human. He called it the religion of his ancestors was atheism, because he just didn't. His whole family never grew up with it.
In Wikipedia, they said that he was a free thinker. He was raised by free thinkers.
Yeah, and he was actually organized about it.
Yeah. How can you be organized in a non-religious way?
He was one of the. He was, I think, the honorary president of the American Humanist Association for many, many years.
Okay, I believe I did know that. That's weird.
That whole subculture, which up until very recently, it's another very long story. I was a big part of myself and got out of it because it's full of horrible people.
What's a group that's full of horrible people? Any number of groups.
Oh yeah, as soon as a bunch of people get together, it's just all downhill from there.
Because somebody wants to be the boss, and then.
Well, he's very. That's the thing about Vonnegut. He's the most genuinely humanist writer I've ever read, in that he, all of his books are about, even the ones that are sad and depressing, and he was a sad, depressed dude. He
had some.
Suicide was a huge part of his life. His mother committed suicide. His sister died of cancer in an insane asylum.
Oh, wow.
Her husband, and I can't remember which of them died first, but her husband died in a train wreck within like a week of her each other.
Wow.
Vonnegut adopted 3 of their children. He ended up raising 7 kids. 3 were his own. 3 were his adopted nieces and nephews.
Okay.
And 1 was another adopted kid. But Vonnegut himself attempted suicide in 1984 with pills and alcohol. Didn't take.
Mm-hmm. Sure, he did what he could, but sometimes.
But all of his books are celebrations of, the best and worst in everybody.
Yeah, it is. That is one of the great things about is he does want to scuttle around inside people's brains and find that which is redeemable and that which is contemptible. Mm-hmm. And that's the great character work. Yeah.
Yeah, there are very few I can't even think of a villain in a Vonnegut book.
Yeah, even the villains are. Did you see Tangled?
No.
Because the mom in Tangled steals Rumpelstiltskin. And Rapunzel. Oh, crying out loud. This is a great episode of me not knowing any names.
It's fine.
So Rapunzel, she steals her as a baby because her hair is magical. Mm-hmm. And I don't remember that from the original story, but whatever. And so she puts her in a tower, and if you touch her hair while the kid sings, you get your youth back or whatever. So the mom in Tangled is an evil witch, except for that the mom in Tangled, who steals this baby as an evil witch, raises this child, Rapunzel.
Yeah.
And when you look at how she's living, you're like, this is not great. She is trapped in this tower and can never leave. But she, has music lessons and art lessons. And it felt very much like my stepmother. Mm-hmm. So I had more sympathy for Rapunzel's mom. I was like, no, she did a bad thing. She stole a baby, but then she raised the baby for her own purposes.
Yeah.
But she raised it and she did the best she could. And then what was she given for it, of course, is she is saved and goes back to her original parents, which was where she belonged.
Yeah.
But it was such a complex character in a children's movie where the witch is just supposed to be very black and white. Mm-hmm. Where you're like, I have some, not sympathy for the mother, but yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
There's no
I noticed that I saw Frozen.
Okay, how was that?
I liked it.
I heard it was good.
Yeah, there's
Spoiler?
Not really a spoiler, but there for most of that movie there's no villain until there's kind of a dumb twist.
Okay.
But
to create a villain?
yeah, but they didn't really need it.
Because it could have just been a tale of what? What is the tale of Frozen?
It's mostly just about a girl who has this magical power that is dangerous.
Okay.
And her parents' philosophy for dealing with this is to basically just shut it all inside and never show the world that you can do these things.
Oh,
And-
Lutherans. Okay.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. It's Garrison Keillor wrote it. No, it's and so that's what most of the movie's about. Like there's no villain. Like the villain is this concept of repression.
Okay.
But then it gets very Disney at the end. But
right.
But what were we talking about? I
But
was
it
going
could
to
have
bring
been-
this back
Because a Vonnegut doesn't have
Yeah.
a villain. He doesn't usually have a villain.
Right. And yeah, and so in Bluebeard, like the reason the book is called Bluebeard, there's that tale of the guy who killed all his wives, and there's this one room they can't go into. The main character, Raybo Karabekian,
Nice.
he when he's old and he's living out in the Hamptons, he has this potato barn that has something in it, and he won't tell anybody what's in it. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that his like masterwork is he bought up all of these bare canvases that used to have his paintings, but all the paint fell off.
Yeah.
And he clamps them all together into one giant canvas, and he's just spent his latter days in there just painting this, using like his natural talent as a realist painter, painting this so realistic that you can take like a magnifying glass and see like the details and the reflections in people's eyeballs. And it's just this one scene, which is sort of a fantasized version of what he saw in World War II when he...
I do remember that.
yeah, he sort of crawled up on top of a hill and saw the aftermath.
That was
of this.
mind blowing. I remember being genuinely moved by that when I finished
It's
Bluebeard.
incredibly moving, and it works as sort of a general theme of, this is when he finds his voice. This is his masterpiece because it's the
Right.
first thing he's done with it. He actually has his soul in it,
Right, that came from it.
and
That's great.
and it also works as sort of a metaphor for Vonnegut because he didn't. He didn't really find his voice until Slaughterhouse-5. Once he did, and he was able to confront himself head on, that's when his biggest success happened.
Right.
And it took a very long time for him to get there compared to other people's careers.
Right. And he had published seven books before Slaughterhouse-5, but some of his greatest stuff were these books after.
Yeah, and there's good stuff before. Like that's the thing too about Bluebeard is that the stuff that Raybo Karabekian makes before is good.
Right.
But it doesn't have that extra oomph.
That extra oomph, yeah.
And so, and there are so many things that, like, when I was rereading it recently, it made me think about fan fiction and
Yeah.
like my problems with fan fiction,
Now what is your problem with fan fiction?
which is that it's spinning wheels. It's people that are taking this inspiration and not really,
and
like,
not creating something new?
yeah. And new, I think, is a kind of a misnomer.
Okay.
It doesn't necessarily have to be new, because nothing is 100% original.
Right.
But the originality in any kind of art comes from
Right. So
what you put into it.
Right. Like I've done competitive erotic fan fiction.
I love that show.
That show's ridiculous and hilarious. And I've done it 3 times. And my favorite one was the one I wrote with 2 characters from Magic the Gathering. Mm-hmm. I took 2 cards and I created a scene that was, and I don't know enough I just made up. I grabbed some of their backstory off of but what I did was I found a lot of erotic fan fiction based in Magic the Gathering while I was doing my research about these 2 characters.
There's a lot of lit erotic. Wait, no, that's not it. Oh, fanfiction.net.
Yes. I have several friends who write.
Some of the craziest erotic fan fiction. I love Garfield erotic fan fiction.
Oh, really?
There's a whole
Is it him
series.
and some lasagna?
I think there's one is him and Natalie Portman.
That was, because, I mean, I do like the idea of fan fiction because because when I was a kid, I used to play that. I
Yeah.
used to be like, what if Tarzan ended up on the Starship Enterprise? What would happen? That's more of a mashup.
Yeah.
But that's, or what if I got to hang out with Tarzan, in the jungle? A lot of Tarzan, fanfic when I was a child.
Yeah. I think it's a good, it's good as an exercise.
Yeah.
I think. And also if you're like a TV writer, if you want to be a TV writer and you're coming on board a show.
Oh yeah. It's perfect.
I mean, Jane Espenson, who wrote for Buffy and she wrote for all these great shows, she started her writing career by sending in a spec script for Star Trek Deep Space Nine.
Okay.
And, basically that's fan fiction.
Yeah.
I love comic books, and if you jump on board writing Superman, you're basically playing with other people's toys.
That's it.
There's not a whole lot of difference there. But you know what? I would much rather read something like, I love that stuff.
Right.
But if I had to choose, like Brian K. Vaughan wrote some entertaining Ultimate X-Men comic books.
Right.
I would much rather read his Y the Last Man or Saga.
Right.
Things that come from his
right out of his
heart.
head. Yeah.
I mean, like when you were starting out in stand-up, like how long do you think it took for you to reach that point?
Well, the speculation is that it takes about 4 years, but that my new album is called This Will Make an Excellent Horcrux because it has my soul in it. It has a lot of stuff that's super personal and very internal. And whether it's funny or not, we will find out. We will find out if the American public is interested. But, because I just recorded it a couple of weeks ago. So
that's what's so scary. Yeah. I've always been interested in comedy and done comedy stuff.
Right. It's comedy stuff.
And,
how is that different than just comedy?
Well, it's not. But there are many different aspects. There's improv, there's sketch writing, there's acting, there's stand-up. The thing that always, I know I would never be a great stand-up because it's so terrifying. Because to be a great stand-up, you have to put so much of yourself in a very literal way.
Very much so. But it's interesting to me when people say, well, he's just doing a character. And you're like, yeah, that's him though. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's when you create some sort of art and you are drawing, let's say you're a painter and you draw something hateful. Mm-hmm. There is a part of you. Why are you drawing that? I mean, what are you saying in that? There are people who do hateful stand-up comedy that they're like, it's just a character. You're like, that's great if it has a twist on the end. Mm-hmm. If it has a point for doing it instead of just, I'm going to beat up retarded people with my words. Yeah. Is there a way in the end of it that you are somehow retarded? Or, I want there to be a twist where you aren't the hero.
Oh, sure.
Where you are the slow clap jock at the end of this joke. That's all I want. Make sure you can be the coolest person in the world in your act until you appreciate the little guy. I mean, everyone makes fun of the little guy all the time. That person is downtrodden for a reason. Mm-hmm. Stand-up comedy, in my opinion, exists to turn the table on that. Is to do something else with the little guy.
Comedy in general, I think that's the key to it.
Right. I mean,
bad comedy always comes from a place of power directed at the powerless. Good comedy always comes from the powerless directed at the power.
Yeah, it doesn't even make any sense to me. Why would you make fun of the powerless? Because why don't you shoot a barrel full of fish unless you need to eat fish? Mm-hmm. And I get it. You want to buy land? You can make fun of the powerless, but it doesn't make any sense to me to make fun of the powerless. Write a joke, write something fun. And, but what I thought was interesting about Vonnegut when you were talking about how there wasn't a villain, I was thinking about other characters, other sort of older science fiction of that genre. There weren't necessarily clear-cut villains. Mm. Like Heinlein, there were nebulous, even Orwell. There are these nebulous powers, right? That are the bad guys. But there's not...
They're kind of almost aspects of human nature more than anything else.
Yeah, it's not Jafar. Mm-hmm. He's not an evil sorcerer that's keeping Aladdin down. This is, it's an idea. And that's what I think is great about Vonnegut. Yeah. And makes it more rereadable.
I've kind of been rediscovering lately these writers that sort of passed me by, that were in that era. that sort of golden age of short fiction, speculative fiction era, who kind of married those two aspects of it in really interesting ways, like that sort of yarn spinning and then also the sort of introspective character-based stuff. I've become
Who do you like?
big fan lately of Fritz Lieber.
Lieber. I've heard of him.
I think it's Lieber. Maybe it's Lei.
Right. I'll look it up. I'll look it up.
IE. He has this series of books, these characters called Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. That at first
Sounds awesome. But
at first glance, it seems like a sword and sorcery kind of Conan the Barbarian type thing. Fafhrd is this very Conan-esque sort of hulking barbarian guy. The Grey Mouser is sort of a D&D nerd might call him a rogue type gentleman. And then they hook up and have all these adventures. But and they're definitely like over the top, sort of action packed Conan type stories.
Right.
But they quip and they fight, and there's like interesting dialogue and interesting ideas going through these things that has a little bit of a spark to it that other writers don't.
Okay. And that's from the 50s and 60s and 70s?
From like I think more primarily the 50s.
Oh, nice.
And then into the 60s. And then he has a bunch of weird, I haven't even gotten into them yet.
Yeah.
They're like on my reading list, all these crazy, weird sci-fi, like standalone stories.
Oh, wow. Yeah, Todd Mason has sent me, every year for a couple of years, he's been sending me this short science fiction magazine. And I have a hard time reading short fiction for some reason. Andy loves it. He's constantly reading some short, but the only short fiction I've ever been able to really get into are comic books. And maybe because it's serialized or something, but I wish I could read more short fiction, because when you think about the prose that you can do, the writing can be a lot denser, and yet it can, and the topic can be a lot more easily resolved, that type of thing.
There's a lot of freedom in that's actually one of the things I like about writing sketch comedy, is that it's not like a play, it's not like a movie, it's not like a TV show. It's a world that you've created that lasts for 3 to 5 minutes, or 8 minutes if you're on Saturday Night Live.
Right. 5 minutes too long if you're on television.
And then that's it. So you can do whatever you want to these characters, and you should.
And you should.
If you don't, you've failed.
Right. You've wasted some effort there to some extent. I get that there's an arc to that too, right? To learn how to write. How long have you been writing sketch comedy?
A long time. I've only been serious. I've done it since I was a kid, but I've got really serious in the past 2 years or so.
A couple episodes ago, I had Brandy Brown on. Her dorkdom was the Supreme Court of the United States. And her favorite sketch comedy, besides Key and Peele, she said, is Sesame Street.
Sesame Street does some good stuff.
Well, I didn't even think of it as sketches, but she was like Home Lamb. It's a bunch of lambs, and then there's a big bad wolf, and it's Home Lamb, and Law and Order Special Letters Unit. The letter M goes missing.
Sure.
The Sons of Poetry. And there's some rhyming going down with some motorcycle dudes.
Well, the TV's on. The parents have to watch this stuff.
Right.
But I think the kids get a lot out of it too. It's like, the best kids stuff is not condescending.
Right. And it's so much more effort than what you think it has to be, that I just appreciate that effort. You're like, oh, good. Somebody cared enough to do it right.
That's the best. When you're surprised that something is as good as it is.
Yeah.
That's like one of my favorite TV series of all time is the rebooted Battlestar Galactica.
Oh, right.
I could not have been less interested in watching that show, and then it turned out to be like one of my favorite things ever made.
It's super intense.
But it's, I don't know, we're probably running out of time.
Yeah. Well, we're good.
For short fiction,
right,
I can recommend. I was going to bring this up because I think that this is the writer now who I think has sort of inherited the Vonnegut mantle, if there is one.
Okay.
I think Mark Twain, Vonnegut, and now George Saunders.
Okay. Oh, wait a minute. I feel like I've read some George Saunders.
He has a few short story collections out. He only does short fiction. He does nonfiction as well. But he has a short story collection called Pastoralia. I think his first one was called Civil War Land in Bad Decline.
Okay.
And he has a new one that just came out this year. I think it's his best, called 10th of November.
Okay.
And
it's short fiction, and it's speculative fiction and science fiction?
Kind of. He has a lot of stories that he's kind of obsessed with the idea of artificiality. Mm-hmm. This artificiality meant to approximate something real. And so he has a lot of stories that are set in kind of strange types of theme parks. He has a story that's... So, for instance, here's something that's representative. So he has this story that's set in this theme park that's supposed to show how cavemen lived. But there's actually these two actors who their entire lives are spent in a cave pretending to be cavemen.
Yeah.
And then, so their whole job all day long is for tourists who walk by to live as if they're cavemen who watch them.
Uh-huh.
And then at specified times, they're able to go into this like back room and get like a fax from the corporate headquarters, telling them how good of a job they did that day.
Wow.
It's this kind of weird dystopian theme park. And then the whole short story is about this deteriorating relationship between the husband and the wife caveman actors.
Oh.
And he has a few stories like that. In his latest collection, there's something sort of similar about all these people that are taking part in this same scientific experiment. He has a story about people who are in this kind of like colonial sort of churning butter, like Colonial Williams.
Okay, Williamsburg kind of,
kind of thing. That's a theme that keeps popping up.
Okay,
it's this sort of artificiality,
this sort of forced existence in a very structured area.
Yeah,
as a job.
Yeah, how it's like sort of trying to find our humanity in a world that's nothing but like fake versions of things that we wish were true.
Right. That is so interesting because it's not, and the character work on this is interesting. Like, cause I need to know who the people are, in a book.
It's like my favorite story from his new collection is just like, it's one of those short stories. Like you can only do this in a short story where the whole story is just like maybe 45 seconds of time.
Okay.
And it's about this kid who is witnessing his neighbor who he has a crush on, this teenage girl, getting kidnapped by some creeper who like stops in a van and just drags her to the van.
Right.
And the whole story is just like this moment of him like deciding what he's going to do about that.
Oh, wow.
It's just wonderful. And it's the things that are similar to Vonnegut. There's a lot of differences.
Right.
The similarities
as well there ought to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's sad. His stories are sad but funny, and they are all about sort of people just doing their best.
Oh, right.
in the face of humanity, which can sometimes be very nice and sometimes can be very horrible, and sometimes just be completely nonsensical.
Yeah, Maria Bamford's doing this joke where at the end of it is we're all just doing the best we can, and sometimes it's just not that good. And so that is interesting because one of my favorite authors is this woman, Lois McMaster Bujold. She's on an earlier episode, and it's not sword and sorcery sci-fi. It's sort of, think of it as like a Firefly kind of Han Solo-y kind of sci-fi.
Kind of adventure-y?
It's adventure-y. It's space opera. Okay. I think is what the actual term is.
Mm-hmm.
And her character work is fascinating because it's all done in dialogue. You know, what I've noticed with a lot of male science fiction writers is that it's all done in thought bubbles. Like it's all narrative. In my favorite female characters, female writers, it's all done. They're like, really, are you still talking? We're going to talk about our feelings. It's almost a caricature of what it is.
Oh, yeah.
But it's so, I do love because when you have a narrative like Heinlein and Vonnegut, who I love Heinlein, even though there's a lot of orgies going on. Mm-hmm. But with those guys, and Ian Banks too, though Ian Banks does do more dialogue actually, but, the narrative can be a separation, you know, where you're thinking about what you're going to do. You're thinking about how you're going to react to things. You're thinking about how you did what you did and how you reacted to something. In Lois McMaster Bujold's books, and even Anne McCaffrey, though the writing isn't great, the stories are great, but the dialogue is fascinating because it's someone going, well, this is what I'm thinking about and I'm going to do this. And they're like, well, why would you do that? And you're like, because of this reason. And then we do it. And so it's more like a TV show to some extent, I think.
Yeah, I think that's the strength. I think that's why we're in this sort of like golden age of TV with all these like incredibly great shows, because TV has the luxury of just being nothing but character.
Yeah.
You know, like Breaking Bad is everybody in the world's favorite show right now, and it's just a complete character study. You can't really do that in a movie. Although, you know, the best movies are ones that understand that character is the most important thing. I think that's why Marvel Comics is having such a great run in movies, is because they get that it doesn't matter. You know, nobody really cares about the costume, and nobody really cares about all this other
Right. The action
stuff.
is great, and the action is easy to do now. Now it's just plug and play with all this action stuff because of the CGI and all this stuff. The character, it is for me why Marvel is better than DC.
Yeah.
Is because I know more about what Logan Wolverine is thinking about.
Yeah.
I know more about why Captain America is Captain America than what is happening in Superman's head.
Sure.
You know?
If Spider-Man is about Peter Parker,
Yeah.
and Superman is about a costume.
Yeah, Superman is about some sort of weird giant ideal that isn't real.
Yeah.
Like Clark Kent, what's happening there? And what can you do? And what can't you do? I mean, the thing about Superman, for me, I love the origin story of Superman and I'll watch that over and over and over again, quite honestly. But, cause it's the only time when he has any doubts. It's the only time when he has any growth at all.
That's why they keep retelling it.
Right. Cause you're like, well, what else? He's so powerful and so impervious that you're like, well, does he have any insecurities? Did you read in, Incorruptible, and there was Irredeemable and Incorruptible. Irredeemable was about a Superman character. It was an Image title, I think. No, it might have been Boom or IDW. It wasn't Image, I don't think. But it was, Irredeemable was about a Superman character who snaps. And then kills everyone. Almost everyone.
Oh, I heard about this. Yeah, this
Yeah.
became very highly recommended.
Yeah, it is, Irredeemable. Very dark, and Incorruptible about a supervillain in that same world who hears about the Irredeemable character and is like, oh, well, Jesus, now I gotta get my act together so that I can fight this fuck.
Yeah.
And cause the Incorruptible guy becomes more powerful the less he sleeps. But we are introduced to the Incorruptible guy when he is having sex with an underage, like he's a supervillain. He's having sex with some 15-year-old runaway. And he's like, yeah, well, I guess I gotta get my act together. You're gonna have to go find your parents. And
Wow.
it's so dark. But the Irredeemable character, I mean, there's definitely something there for Superman because the Irredeemable character, the Superman character, can hear everything, right? So there is a tool bag in every scene where he is saved. He just stops an airplane, right? From crashing into things that's great. And it was at a baseball game. And there's one guy in the crowd who goes, why would he wear his tights on the outside? What a fag or something, right? And something horrible.
Yeah.
And he can hear everything. He can hear everything. He's being mocked. He's being, beloved, all of it. And he finally just snaps and he just kills and kills and kills. And everybody joins together to stop him from killing and they cannot. And it's a fascinating story of how they eventually
That's
get
really
it together.
interesting. It kind of sounds a little bit like that movie Chronicle. I don't know if you saw that.
Is that Riddick?
No.
that one of
That's
the
not the
Riddick
Chronicles of Riddick. There's this movie that came out. It was so good. Another one of those ones that was like surprise because I had no idea.
Okay.
It's about these three kids and it's told like kind of in the style of like a found footage movie.
Okay.
Who come across this weird meteorite thing that gives them all these crazy telekinetic powers.
Right. I saw the ad for that.
One of them happens to be a very troubled kid. And so the movie is like, here's what happens when you give someone who doesn't have the tools to handle this some
Right.
incredible power. And it's so well done.
Interesting. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
All right. So you would recommend George Saunders
I would.
for short fiction at this time. And then people should just go back and reread or read Vonnegut.
It's so easy to do. He's such a quick read.
Yeah, it's not. We didn't talk about Jailbird or Slapstick. Both. I like Jailbird. Was Jailbird the one where all of New York got turned into a prison? Or was that something else?
I think
that might have been Hocus Pocus.
That was Hocus Pocus, I think. Jailbird is kind of like the history of the labor movement.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And then Palm Sunday is one of his autobiographical ones.
Yeah, it's just like collections of speeches and things like that.
I loved that one. That was fascinating.
It's great. It's great personal philosophy.
Yeah. And I think I read it right around 1983. Crazy. And then I have not read any of these later ones. When Mortals Sleep or Look at the Birdie or Armageddon, A Man Without a Country. God bless you, Dr. Kevorkian.
Yeah, I mean, later in life, he did a lot of like op-ed type things for magazines and stuff like that. And
Okay.
So a lot of these later collections are things like that. There's a great book of his letters that just came out. I mean, there's tons of stuff.
Right, that guy. He didn't throw anything away. You gotta like it. Brian Thompson from Quit It Podcast, AmateurScientist.org. Also on iTunes, of course.
Also on iTunes.
There we go. And you're going to do the UCB Maud Night. You're going to write for a sketch group that is yet to be named February 18th here in Los Angeles. Thank you so much for doing the Dork Forest.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been great.
That's awesome. Well, that show was awesome. Let's do the credits. Patrick Brady, he fixes the audio every week. He also does the teaser videos on YouTube. So Patrick Brady is an awesome guy, and I thank him for his work. Mike Rickberg sang the song you heard at the beginning, composed and sang it with his girlfriend Sarah. He's going to sing in about a heartbeat for the Mexican Hat Dance. And Vilmos fixes my website, JackieCation.com. So support him and his work. Thanks a lot, you guys. Take care out there. Bye.
My hat, my hat, my hat. They're dancing around my hat. My hat, my hat, my hat. Well, what do you think of that? If it looks like a Mexican hat dance and it sounds like a Mexican hat dance, it's most likely a Mexican hat dance. So take off your hat and let's dance.
Yay! Oh my God. Why don't we just call that as the end of the show?